So welcome to 사랑과영문학, Love and English Literature. I can speak a little bit more Korean than that, but my Korean is pretty bad. I speak like a 2-year-old, I think. But I speak okay in English. My name is Peter Matthews. I have been teaching here at Hanyang this is my 4th year teaching here. It goes by very quickly. I'm originally from Australia, although I spent 9 years as a professor in the United States before I came to Hanyang, to Korea. My area of specialty in terms of the research that I do, the articles that I publish and so on, are mostly in the British novel, and particularly in the area of the contemporary British novel, the novels that are being written around this time, right, around our time today. And so, in fact, as we'll see in a moment, we're going to be reading 2 novels that are relatively recent. They're not older novels such as Daniel Defoe or Jane Austen or any of those older novelists, but 2 contemporary novelists. So let me begin by giving you the syllabus. We'll go over that very quickly. We'll talk about some of the expectations for this course, and then I'm going to talk to you about some of the approaches for how do we look at these texts, how do we read these novels, and how do we analyze and understand what is happening in them. Okay, so first of all, my details, where my office is, and also my email on the front of the syllabus. So if you need to contact me, email is usually the best way, the quickest way, the most efficient way. But do make sure that when you spell my name, my last name, my family name, Matthews, is spelled a little bit unusually, just 1 T, not 2 T's. So if you spell it with 2 T's, it either will get bounced back to you or it will be sent to someone else called Peter David Matthews with 2 T's. I don't know. Okay? So make sure you do spell that correctly. Okay, quickly over the page. We are studying 2 novels this semester. First one, Atonement, right, published in 2001. And our second one, The Dream of Scipio, published in 2002. So at the end of class, to get the first book, you need to go downstairs to the basement and get the course packet from there. Okay? You'll see we have some number of work requirements. Midterm exam, which will focus upon the first novel that we read, Atonement. Right? The final exam, which will focus on the second novel that we read, The Dream of Scipio. Right? And of course, when we get closer to those exams, I will give you more details about how to approach them, and also a week before I give you the questions that I'm going to ask about those texts, because I want you to prepare and to study and to have something ready in your head, planned out to write. You must write the test in class, in exam conditions, but you are allowed to prepare for it beforehand and know what the questions are that you're going to be asked. Okay? All right. The other aspect is that because this course is being recorded, I'm required to lecture for a certain amount of time, for I think 45 minutes. Right? So I will be doing more PowerPoint and more lecturing than I usually do in a class. But the other part of that class time is class discussion. Right? Because as we're going to see in a moment from the PowerPoint that I'll do today, we're going to be looking at how we work out which parts of the story are important, right? To work out what ideas is the author trying to get us to explore in this novel, right, that we'll be reading, right? So there are certain strategies, there are certain skills that we need to use, and of course I'll be demonstrating to you how to use those skills in the PowerPoint. I'm going to give you some examples today. And then, of course, so that you become good at these, right, you will also, as your prep sheets, I want you to, as your homework, read the reading for that week or for that class, and I want you to write down at least 2 moments in the text that you thought were important and why. Right? And bring those sheets in, and you'll hand them in at the end of the class discussion. Right? Now, that part of the homework is not something that is meant to take lots of your time. Right? They don't have to be beautifully written. They don't have to be, perfect. The idea is that they are there so that when I call upon your name, you don't say, oh, what was I going to say? I've forgotten. Right? Instead, you always say, oh, I know, on page 20, I thought this sentence was important, and I thought it was important because of the reason that I wrote down in 1 or 2 sentences. All right? So it doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just something that is there to help you with your memory and to help you when you are put on the spot and asked, what did you think was important about today's reading? Okay? So that's going to be your main homework for each class, is to do the reading and then to create the prep sheet, which is to write down a couple of ideas that you thought were important and present them in class. All right? And of course, the other one there is class participation. That means coming to class, not being late, and participating in our discussions. All right? So, of course, I will lead those. I will give you the lecture with the slideshows and some examples of my own. This is like my prep sheet, my longer prep sheet that I have to do, and then you guys get your chance to exercise those skills for yourself. All right. So, over the page, I just have some basic rules for classroom etiquette too. Please, unless you really need to use electronic devices for, if you're looking up something in a dictionary or something, that's okay. But I don't want to see people, texting and playing with their phones and so on in class. Please be mindful. That's quite rude both to me and to your fellow students. Be paying attention, please, in class. Other basic things like basic courtesy, like if we don't want to have 10 people outside of class going to the restroom, please one at a time. Those sorts of basic etiquette rules, and you can read about them there. Lastly, as it says there, please, if you do have any questions or if you do need any help, I'm more than happy to help you, especially when it comes around to the midterm exam and the final exam. If you're not sure what you're doing, if you want me to look at your plan, if you want me to give you some advice or some help, then do contact me, and I'm happy to help you with anything that you need to know about. All right? Similarly, I sometimes have students at the beginning, if they've never taken me before, come to me and say, oh, am I doing the prep sheet right, or do I understand the story? Please, if you do have those sorts of questions too, I'm happy to help in any sort of way. All right, now the most important part of our syllabus, and the one that tells us what is going on week by week and class by class, is this part here, which is our reading schedule, right? So when I put notes up, because this is going to be seen by a bigger audience, when I put quotations and references up, I'm going to put them as references to the published books, right? So if you see page numbers up on here, they'll be to the published books. Whereas, of course, these numbers here refer to our course packet that you can get from downstairs, right? So read those. So you can see here for our next class on Thursday, please read pages 1 to 17 of Atonement. So you just read those, right? Highlight the parts that you thought are important. Write your prep sheet. Write down a couple of things that you thought were important for class discussion. That's it, right? So next time when you come in here, you'll have read pages 1 to 17. That's the first 2 chapters of the book and are ready for class discussion with your prep sheet. Okay? So that is the basic outline of what we'll be doing in this class, and I'm going to go into more detail in a moment. Are there any questions about the syllabus or the shape of the course before we go on to the next thing? No questions? Okay. All right. So Who here has taken a literature class before? Some of you have, some of you haven't. Put your hand up if you have taken. Yes, you have. One, couple of people. All right, so that means that this will be a good introduction to how to read a literary text, right? Because, of course, there are many different skills required for reading a newspaper article, reading a letter, all those sorts of things. But there are some particular special skills that you need in order to read and to understand a literary text, a novel in this case, in more depth, right, with greater understanding. And that's because the way in which literary texts work, the way in which novels and stories and poems work, is that most of the time there are two levels of a story, right? There are levels in which we have what we call the surface level, which is where the characters and the action and the story are taking place, right? And beneath that level, the level that we need to try and get to and that we need to look at, are the ideas that underlie that story, right? So if we go back in time, we think about some older, like famous, like short little stories that are used to illustrate like moral points. So like Aesop's fables, for example, right? Or the parables that Jesus tells in the Bible, right? They're little stories. So let's take, for example, the story of the prodigal son that Jesus tells, right? And he tells a story about, a son who asks his dad for his money, like his inheritance money early, and then he goes away and he spends it all on partying, and then he comes back to his father and his father forgives him, right? That's all the surface level of the story. Why? Because is the father just the father in this story? We know that the father is actually a symbol, right? That the father in Jesus' story represents God, and that the son represents humanity, and that the story is about forgiveness, right? So the story has this surface level, the characters, the father, the son, and so on, and what happens between them. That's the surface level. But then underneath, we see through the symbols, through the relationships between those symbols, that there's also a deeper level, right? A level that is getting us to think about abstract ideas about forgiveness and relationships and so on, right? So this is something similar to what happens in our novels, but in a much more complicated way, because of course, those short stories like Aesop's fables or Jesus' parables are very short, and they often tell us their meaning at the end. Whereas when we come to read our books, we find if we turn to the end of Atonement or the end of the Dream of Scipio, Ian McEwan doesn't come to the end of Atonement and say, and this is what you should think at the end of this novel. Instead, we have to work that out. And that's what we'll be doing week by week and class by class as we analyze the symbols and the ideas that we see happening beneath the surface of the story. Okay? So, the 3 steps I'm going to give you now are ways of thinking about how, or strategies for thinking about how we can work out what are some of the ideas that the author is trying to get us to explore in this story. Okay. So, first of all, I'm going to tell you, before we get into that, let me tell you the basic premise on which I chose these 2 texts. Of course, when we think about this question of love and literature, there are many different ways that we can think about love. Love isn't just romantic love, right? What are some other kinds of love that we all have in our lives? Right? We have parents who love us. Similarly, we have friends, right? We have friends who love us. We have brothers and sisters sometimes who hate us, and sometimes who love us, right? And so there are all sorts of private friendships that we have, right, of that kind. Husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, regular friends, brothers, sisters, mother, father, right? All sorts of different kinds of private loves. But also, we also have public friendships, right, that are formed by our relationship with our country, by institutions that we might serve, right? So like some of you guys, some of the guys here, they now serve with, have to serve the Korean military duty, for example, right? And all sorts of other ways in which we owe things to our public duties as well. And one of the things that these two novels, both of them explore, are the ways in which private friendship can come into conflict with our public duties, right? That our duties to, say, our country can come in conflict with our family, with our loved ones, and so on, and it explores how those two overlap. All right. So that summarizes what I just said. Okay, so here are the three steps that I mentioned, the three strategies for how we can understand, how we can look for the underlying ideas in the text. First of all, we always want to begin for any story, any text, any poem, whatever we're reading, we always want to think about the context, right? And that leads us to ask questions like, when was it published? Where is the author from? What was influencing them when they wrote it? Maybe it was other writers. Maybe it was historical events that were going on. Maybe it was artistic movements that were happening at the time. Whatever it was, we want to know what are some of the big things that might have influenced the writing and creation of the text. Right? And this, of course, is something that we can do even before we start reading. Right? We can go online, we can look up, oh, yeah, I can see where this author is from. I can see when this was published, those sorts of things. All right, so let's do a quick exercise in that. You see our first novel, Atonement, right? We have some context for it. We can see it was published in 2001. It is written by the British author Ian McEwan, who is one of my favorite authors and is probably one of the leading British authors, living British authors around at the moment. Excuse me. And we currently, when we think about different literary periods, you might have seen that if you studied some other literature, that we tend to divide literature into different periods. So we think about like the Romantic movement. We talk about romantic poetry and romantic novels from people like Jane Austen, or poetry like William Blake, right? The Romantic period, or the Victorian period, where we have people like Charles Dickens, or famous poets like Lord Tennyson, right? So our current period that we are in, we categorize therein, is called postmodernism. We don't need to worry about that label for now very much, but we will talk about some of those ideas as we go along. All right, so he's a postmodern author, basically means he's writing now. And very quickly, if we know a little bit about the story, and remember there are a lot of twists that happen, so if you've seen the movie, or if you know what happens, please don't give them away to your classmates before they have read about those twists. We see that the story begins in 1935, so it's set back in time, and so it's going to deal with questions about history and memory. Right? So here we can just see from the context that this sort of allows us to orient ourselves, to see like where we are coming from with regard to this novel. Right? We know when it's published, we have an idea who the author is, where he's from, and we have an idea a little bit about some of the themes that will be explored. Similarly, for The Dream of Scipio, this is the cover of the paperback, published in 2002, so 1 year later. Also by a British author, Ian Pears. Right? Notice that his name is Ian as well, but it's spelt slightly differently. Extra I in there. Also postmodern, because he's writing in the same period. And of course, I chose these two books to be a pair because they have similarly themed ideas, even though they're quite different stories. Also looking at history and memory and these kinds of questions. Okay. So that's our first step. Always, when you come to read a new story, a new book, a new poem, watch a new film, if you're going to analyze it, you need to know a bit about the context, where it's from, who wrote it, who directed the film, or whatever it is, where it's from, what it was influenced by, right? Very helpful. Okay, now within the story itself, as you are reading it, these next two things, these next two strategies are designed to get you to think about the ways, the strategies that authors use in order to understand, get us to think about the underlying ideas of the text. Now, sometimes authors will create their own symbols, their own metaphors, and I'll talk about one in a moment, right, from Atonement. And sometimes they use symbols that have been around for hundreds, thousands of years, right? So let's begin with one of those, explore one of those first. Probably the most popular symbol across many different cultures, used by poets from Japan to Russia to France to Australia, everywhere, is that of the seasons, right? So summer, autumn, winter, spring, they all have associations with that, with those seasons, right? So we're coming into spring, right? What does spring, if a poet is talking about it, what might they mean? What kind of ideas might be associated with spring? Hope, yes? What else? Anything else? Rebirth, yep. Anything else? Love, yep. Did you say love? Yeah. Love, yep. So these are all ideas that are associated, say, in a poem or a short story or a novel with those ideas. Does hope only happen in spring? No, it doesn't, does it? Right? Do people only fall in love in spring? No, right? It's just that we have attached those symbolic ideas, right, to that particular symbol, right? So similarly, we're just coming out of winter. Well, often, what does winter symbolize? Death? Do people only die in winter? No, they don't, right? So you can see the way in which those symbols are used to get us to think about particular themes or particular ideas, but they're not meant to reflect reality, right? They're meant there to get us to think about a certain idea, to get us to think about a certain theme or idea or notion or philosophy, but they're not there to reflect reality, right? So though there are many of these kinds of traditional common symbols like the seasons that are used by authors, as well, they also have the ability to create their own, right? They can create their own things that have a special meaning that goes beyond just their ordinary literal meaning. And we see this, for example, in chapter 2 of Atonement, which you'll read over the next couple of days, right? And we'll talk about on Thursday. And in that particular chapter, one of the characters, Cecilia, is decorating a room for one of their guests, and she uses a vase, right? And this vase that she's arranging flowers in, right, isn't just any ordinary vase, right? It's a vase that we see has a lot of attachment to their family history. It belonged to one of their uncles who died in the war, and it has, it's very precious. It has all these family history attached to it, right? So it's not just any vase. It's a vase that has special attachment, meaning, significance to them. And so, remember, if you're doing this with your prep sheets, you would say, oh yeah, on this page, in this quote, this is where I saw something important, right? Say, oh yeah, look. Let's see, her dead uncle, her father's dear brother, the wasteful war, the treacherous crossing of the river, the preciousness beyond money, the heroism and goodness, all the years back up behind the history of the base, reaching back to the genius of Horalt, that's the guy who originally created the vase, and beyond him to the mastery of the arcanist who had reinvented porcelain. So this vase is not just any vase, right? It is a vase with special meaning and attachment for this family and for Cecilia, right? It's something special to her and to her family. And therefore, what happens with it, as you'll see in the chapter, is important, right? It's not just like, oh, broke a vase, oh well. No, it's something special. Okay? So, of course, we will see as the story goes along, that it's not just in chapter 2 that this apparently really small event has meaning, but as the story unfolds and gets bigger and bigger, we'll see that the significance of that vase, right, becomes larger and larger and more important to the story, and its symbolism and what it means and how it relates to the characters and their relationships also gets bigger and more important, right? So it goes beyond just being a simple vase. It represents something else. It represents some ideas, memories, relationships in the story. And therefore, we would focus upon that as something to discuss and to analyze, right? Both in class discussion and later on, perhaps in our exam. Okay. Now, our third and final way of finding clues in a literary text is through references to other texts, right? Primarily, of course, a novelist is going to make a reference to other literary authors, to poets, to other novelists, short story writers, right, to artists, right? So, as you can imagine, some of the most famous texts in the history of literature are also some of the most referenced. So, anyone want to take a guess at which would be the most referenced book in all of Western literature? The Bible, right. So it doesn't matter whether the author is religious or not. It doesn't matter whether they're a Christian or not. There are so many, that book has had so much cultural influence that even authors who are against religion will still quote phrases from it, will still make references to stories from that book. And so the Bible is probably the most important reference point, even if you are not religious, even if you are not Christian. So other sources that tend to be used a lot or tend to be quoted a lot by authors are the Greek and Roman myths, right? They're very popular as giving us examples of other stories. And also Shakespeare, being the most famous writer in English, is also the most quoted writer and probably the most quoted writer in the whole world, right? So when authors do this, when they point to other texts, when they point to other stories, they're not just doing this at random, right? They're not just saying, oh yeah, I was reading Hamlet the other day, and they don't just have their characters say that at random. They deliberately put those references into the story. Why? Because they want us to compare their novel, so in this case, Atonement. They want to compare what's happening in their novel, Atonement, to what is happening in the story that is being referenced, or the novel or the author that is being referenced. Okay? So, let me give you an example. All right. In chapter 2, that same character I mentioned a moment ago, Cecilia Tallis, we're told, is reading a novel. Right? So this is a popular way for authors to put a reference into their text. They have their character read a novel, and they won't just pick any novel, they will pick a novel that has some kind of significance for their own story. And in this case, she is reading a book called Clarissa, which she obviously has a lot of time on her hands, because if you've ever seen a copy of Clarissa, it is like a big brick. It is a very long novel, one of the longest in English literature. And but it's a very famous novel by Samuel Richardson, and there are reasons that I can't reveal to you yet because they are about plot points that are going to happen later in the novel that are significant as to why Cecilia is reading this particular novel. There are certain things that happen in Clarissa that are famous for happening in Clarissa that are echoed in the things that happen in Atonement, right? So it's not just chosen at random. It's not just chosen because, I guess I'll make her read A Tale of Two Cities. I guess I'll make her read, Hamlet, whatever. He deliberately chooses this book because he wants us to compare his story to this other story, right? Now, sometimes authors make it easy for us. In this case, McEwan makes it really easy because Cecilia basically says, yeah, I'm reading Fielding's Clarissa at the, Richardson's Clarissa at the moment, right? That's easy because, okay, I'll look that up. What's this book? Find out what it is, right? But sometimes authors also can make it difficult for us, where they can quote from another text without telling us. They can quote a line from, say, the Bible. If we're not familiar with the Bible, we might not recognize it. They might quote a line from Shakespeare. And if we haven't read that Shakespeare play, we don't know it, right? So sometimes authors make it easy for us. They name the story that they are borrowing from, or they name the author. And sometimes they make it difficult for us, and they assume that we recognize the references that they are making to other texts. All right? So it's these three steps that I want you to think about and I want you to use as you come to do your homework for the next class. Right? I want you to think about those contexts that we talked about, when these novels were written, what they're influenced by, and then as you are reading, I want you to look for these symbols and metaphors, things that have deeper significance. They might be traditional symbols like seasons and so on that are talked about. They might be symbols like the vase that McEwan creates for himself. But I want you to think about those things and also to think about references. What literary references does he make? Are there references to history? Are there references to important things that have happened that might influence the story? But overall, what I want you to pick out as you are reading and in your prep sheets is two parts of the story that you thought were important, and write down very briefly why. Right? Is that clear to everyone? So read those pages, 1 to 17, the first 2 chapters. Right? As you're reading, think, okay, page 10. I saw something there. I want to talk about this symbol, or I want to talk about this sentence, or I want to talk about this paragraph that McEwan is talking about. And please do make it specific. Don't just say, I thought about the writing and the whole reading. Right? Make it specific. Make it say on a particular page or a particular paragraph. And just write down very briefly, 1 or 2 sentences, no more, why you thought it was important. Right? So bring that in for next time, and we will discuss those. And then at the end of the class, you hand those in, and those go towards your prep sheet grade. Okay? So the prep sheet grade is very simple to work out, because remember I said to you, it's not based upon like you have to write it beautifully and make no mistakes or anything like that. It's there to help you to speak in class. Right? So basically, if you do all the prep sheets, you hand them all in, then you get the full grade for that. Right? That's for effort. Okay. Okay, so if there's still no questions, very good. It's the same as, yes, the booklet I have here, and I'll be rereading from. Okay? But for the notes, for the PowerPoint, because other people will be out there in the world, will be seeing them, they will need to be able to need to refer to the published version. Okay. So yes, the first thing to do, after we finish class in a moment, go downstairs and get your copy so that you can read for Thursday. Okay. All right, very good. Thank you, guys. I'll see you on Thursday, and we will discuss pages 1 to 17, the first 2 chapters of Atonement. Thank you.